Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Edutopia session. Tonight, we're going to be covering all things assessment. If you joined us for our previous session, welcome back. And if this is your first one, we're so glad you're here. My name is Madison. I live in Idaho, and I'm on the community team here at Edutopia. And just so you know who we are, I'll tell you a little bit about Edutopia. It is a nonprofit organization that's a part of the George Lucas Educational Foundation. That was founded in 1991 by, you guessed it, George Lucas, the filmmaker. Edutopia's mission is to share what works in education. We are all about helping educators take the strategies that work for them in their schools and their classrooms, and then share that with other educators across the country and the world. And that's exactly what happens in an Edutopia session. So I will let you know how tonight's session is going to go. We're going to have a quick introduction to all the folks who are involved in the event. Then you'll get a framework to ground the discussion. We'll hear from our panel of educators. First, it'll be questions from our moderator, and then there'll be a portion for questions from all of you. And just a few logistical details. So this is a webinar format. Mics are muted, cameras are turned off, but please keep engaging in the chat and send any of your questions. Ask clarity on anything that is said throughout the session. There are several members of the Edutopia team who are here to answer your questions, and the best way for you to submit those is through the Q&A feature. That way everything's all organized in the same place and doesn't get lost in the chat. We are recording the event, and we'll send you a link to that recording in an email tomorrow. We'll also send you resources from today's session, including some of the questions and answers from all of you. These are some of the people who will be answering your questions and who helped make this event happen. I want to give them a big thank you. Behind the scenes, we have Alicia, John, and Will, who are educators and Edutopia community facilitators, as well as Sammer and Hannah from our community team. In the chat tonight are Katie and Laura, who are both educators and Edutopia facilitators. So thank you all so much for helping make this happen. And then last but not least, here are our moderator and panelists. Monty is a middle school science teacher in Washington, D.C. and a community facilitator for Edutopia. Laura is a former teacher and librarian, and she is currently core faculty at Antioch University, New England. Laura is also an author, as well as a key member of Edutopia's editorial and community teams. Jay is an educator of over 40 years focusing on science and math. Jay recently retired as a new teacher mentor for his district, and he writes on a range of topics for Edutopia. Audra is entering her third year in education. She shares her experiences on Edutopia as a new teacher, focusing on solutions to common problems. So thank you all so much for joining us to talk about assessment, and now I'll pass it to Monty.
Hi, everyone. As Madison said, thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited to have this conversation today about assessment. Before I allow the panel to kind of start answering some questions, I'm going to pass it off to Laura for her to kind of do some framing for our conversation, and then we'll jump into our questions.
Thank you so much, Monty. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us today. One thing that teachers spend a lot of time thinking about is how much their students are learning. You know, it's really the bread and butter of our work. We want to know what our students know, what they still need to learn. And we also want to make sure that they know what they're supposed to know, right, as they're moving through their educational experience. I think for new teachers, it's even more complicated because assessment is one of those things that seems simple until you try to do it, and then it's pretty complex. I think one of the places that we really muddy the waters is in our use of language. We talk about three things as though they're the same thing: assessment, evaluation, and grading. But actually, they're not the same thing. Assessment is the gathering of information. It is just gathering data. Evaluation is putting that information alongside some kind of a standard or a set of expectations. And grading is communicating what that means to the outside world. So when we move into this conversation today, I want you to keep in mind that this is a complex process that we're talking about. And I want to remind you, especially our newer educators, that you're a learner too. As you move through your educational experience, you're going to do some assessment and evaluation of your own experience, your own skills as an educator, and you're going to learn stuff. You're going to change. You're going to learn more stuff. You're going to change again, and on and on and on, because teachers are students too. We are students of our students every single day. In fact, I'd say the teacher is really the most important student in the room. So in our conversation today, you're going to hear a lot of interesting ideas. And I want you to remember that these ideas are great and they're somebody else's ideas. Some may be a great fit for you right now, some may be a great fit for your students, and some may not be. So it's okay to say, yep, I definitely want to try that someday. It's okay to say, I'm definitely going to try that tomorrow. And it's okay to say, no, thanks. I don't think that's a fit for me right now. No one is expecting you to try everything that you hear every single minute, because you hear a lot of stuff. So I want you to be thoughtful about your own zone of proximal development. You remember that stuff from your prep program, as well as that of your students. So if something doesn't feel like a good fit for you or a good fit for your students, it is just fine to say no, thank you. Give yourself a ton of grace as you're going through these early years of your career. And let's get back to our conversation. We have a lot of good stuff to share tonight.
Thank you, Laura. So Laura, just told us that assessment is the gathering of data. Jay, I'm curious, do you think that is how you define assessment?
I'd say definitely. And I think one of the pieces that we're going to delve into is like, yes, we talk about formative and summative assessments, but really we're continuously assessing. We're assessing by quick checks, whether it's, fist to 5 or where your thumbs are as far as how your understanding is at this moment in time. Reading the room as you're going over something that's really relatively new and complex and seeing how many heads are nodding and how many are just totally lost, all the way up to the point where I'm doing an assessment of what you've learned this entire semester in this complex class that we've covered. So everything in between there, that's what our work is. We're helping students learn, and we should be continuously assessing in a variety of different ways how successful we are and how successful they are.
How about you, Audra? Do you have a similar definition, or do you see assessment as something different?
I would say that Laura and Jay, also thank you for asking, but Laura and Jay kind of hit it on the head. I guess one thing I was thinking about is that assessment's a spectrum. And if I could dare say it's a spectrum from unserious to very serious, or to not high stakes to low stakes. And so that's all.
And so, Audra, I'm gonna keep you up here for a second. Jay talked a little bit about formative versus summative. When you say serious versus unserious, do you see maybe like formative being a little bit more of the like unserious, while summative might be a little bit more serious? Or can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sorry about that. When I say unserious, I mean unserious for the kids. For me, all assessment is really important because it helps drive that curriculum. But just like what Laura was talking about, and Jay has mentioned a few times, not in this, but that student zone of proximal development can really be affected by the emotional state they are in before they walk into the test.
And passing it back to Laura for a second, you talked a lot in the beginning about, giving like teachers basically having grace, and assessment being the gathering of data. What purpose does it serve for a teacher, especially a new teacher, and like how they can frame their practice?
The purpose of assessment is actually one of those questions that we study in educational philosophy, because depending on your philosophy of education, the reason for the assessment can shift a little bit. In some cases, folks think that assessment is about sorting kids into different levels of attainment, different tracks. Other folks view the assessment process as purely a way to gather information. And so for me personally, assessment comes from the Latin assidere, I believe is how it's pronounced, which just means to sit beside. And so when I think about assessment, it's about sitting beside someone to find out what they know, and then to figure out how I can better support them in growing in a direction that makes sense, in terms of academic expectations and also their development as a whole human being.
Okay, I like that a lot. And Jay, you were the one that mentioned earlier about formative and summative. Can you actually tell the audience a little bit of like how they differ from each other? And if you have any examples of things you've done, that'd also be really great.
Yeah, no, I think, and I've taught a variety of different, from introductory classes to AP classes. The formatives were like the continuous kinds of check. I think older school, it'd be like, okay, homework's formative because you're doing the practice and you're getting some feedback on that. And there's a whole question about, well, should that feedback be part of your grade, or should that just be the practice that I'm giving you some clarification on about, yes, you're getting the practice, or no, you need more. But it's the process along the way to help, whether it's like, yes, you're meeting this goal that we have, or oh, a bunch of you haven't met this particular piece in a question. And sometimes it's, you come in as a warm-up, I'm going to have a formative assessment where I can find out, does everybody actually understand what we did the last time that we met? And then that's basically helping me continue to build what their knowledge acquisition is, to the point where at some point I have a collection of things that we've been trying to accomplish in a unit, in a project, whatever it happens to be. And now you and I need to confirm that we've achieved that. And that's my summative assessment. And again, there's a variety of things within schools, within departments, within regions, as far as whether that, okay, that's the be all end all and the summative's done and now we move on, or if that's also, okay, now we're going to use that data and help repair something that we thought we had fixed, or we are good to go on and we're going to build onto that in the next one. But essentially, the district I worked in had moved pretty much to formatives were just, that's practice. We're building skills. We're going to get repetition. We're going to do a little check to see whether you're confident in those, and then we're going to do some kind of performative task, whether it's a test, a project, whatever it happens to be, to confirm that yes, that's where you are, and that's the summative part.
And then my follow-up question, and Audra and then Laura, you can both answer, but how do we make sure that things like formative assessment are meaningful for kids, where it doesn't just feel like another thing that we're adding to their plate? Like, how do we make it meaningful?
And did you want me to
So
take that, or go on to Audra?
Or whoever actually wants to go first.
I'll go first. Sorry about that. I guess when I think of meaningful formative assessment, I think about the timing of it. So there is a big difference in understanding between right after the lesson, during the lesson, and then maybe a weekend from the lesson. And so timing is one way you can have a really meaningful formative assessment. And then another thing that I think of makes a meaningful formative assessment is if you know your target goal for that day and that target goal matches that assessment or that formative assessment, I think you'll get clear data.
Laura,
Yeah.
do you have anything that you want to add? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, only just an example, I feel like the best formative assessment data is gathered when learners are actually using the stuff that they are supposed to know how to do, whatever content it is that you've been teaching. So when I was in the library, one of the things that I felt like I was teaching all the time was just how to find a book in the library. How do you know where the fiction is? How do you know where the everybody books are, the picture books? How do you know nonfiction? And how do you figure out where to find what you want in the nonfiction or the graphic novels? And so when the kids went to look for books, that was an easy formative assessment for me. Which kids are able to sort of get to the right spot generally, and which kids are in front of me saying, where are the books about dinosaurs? And so that was right there, I could tell, who needed a little bit more support around that content. And then when it came to other, in teaching English, when I used to teach English, it was the same thing. When I could tell just from looking at students' writing how much they had already sort of internalized about the the work that we were doing, and who still needed support around certain areas. I think one of the really important pieces with formative data is to understand that no single data point is ever going to be completely accurate. You're sort of looking at a scatter plot. We all have bad days, and we go through rough periods. And so I think that it's important to keep in mind that your formative data it's not a one shot. It has to be looked at over time.
I want to chime on to one other thing that Audra mentioned, that target, that what is they're supposed to be getting out of that particular day. We've had this, the clarity is kindness, pop up in a variety of Edutopia articles and some discussions, And when the students walk in and they see, here's what I'm supposed to exit the day understanding, whether it's a learning target, objective, however you're going to frame it, then it's like, okay, now I have a way that I can actually see if we've accomplished that. And whether that's an exit ticket, a quick check at the end, or something the next day, that part then is like, okay, I know what I was supposed to learn and I've accomplished that. Or it's like, I still don't understand this, I need to do more. And as the teacher with the students, like, we're good this period, and something happened next period and they didn't get it, so I need to do a little bit more with them. But then you have, as you get towards the summative assessment, here's the learning targets that we've been doing. How are we doing on all these? We don't need to review because you're good on all of these. Or, target 7 and 8, we're still short on. Let's spend a little more time on that.
Let's switch gears a little bit now and talk a little bit about planning for assessment. Like, how do we actually make the time to plan for good assessment, not just things that we're doing because we have to, but like actually planning for, really good assessment. And Audra, would you like to start us with the discussion?
Yeah, I like to be in and out. I don't like to spend more time at school than I have to. So I am like maybe the queen of this question. The way to do it, from my perspective, is the best way to do it is with groundwork. In the summer, backwards design. So what you want to do is that. Okay, what a person who would want to follow this goal would want to do is that they would want to understand every single standard and what unit that standard's connected to and where they plan on assessing it and when it's going to be reassessed. And if you know when those meaningful times are to do that formative assessment, I think it'll be a time saver. And then like physically creating the assessment. If I'm really on a time crunch, like it's like 5 minutes and the kids are walking in, I'll use a AI and double check it. Human going in, AI, human going out response. I prefer not to use AI for my own personal reasons. But for a quick assessment, you can always do a mix and match. I've also done it where I've made it a class assessment where I've had pictures on the boards, different quotes, and they've had to sort it and organize it, tier it. And then also if you're in the middle of a lesson and you're like, man, I don't know if I can continue because these kids are lost. And then you are like, any questions? And they're like, we don't have questions. You can actually take the job right then of being of giving an assessment. Ask them to take out a whiteboard or a piece of paper and write down the process of the skill or knowledge that you would like them to learn. And then they can assess themselves and assess where they're getting lost in the lesson. I have a list of fun kind of lesson ideas or formative assessment ideas I do at the end of a lesson. It includes like digital computer games. There's an onion game where you can write like a series of questions on papers and fold it over each other like an onion. And you toss it, and the kid who catches it has to read the question and then answer it with the help of like a teammate. And if you really want like a serious collection of data where it's high stakes, where I would build the questions for that high stakes assessment as you're teaching the lessons. And so that while you're getting your formative lessons, like your formative assessment feedback, you know exactly what spots to hit in that summative assessment. And then you're not doing a ton of research on student performance for the past semester for that semester project or exam. Sorry, that was a little long.
Jay, Laura, anything that you want to add?
Jay, you can go ahead.
No, I think one of the keys is that backward design. It's like, whatever it's a unit or project, whatever it is, like when they exit this, whether it's standards or whatever, what do I want to have them have accomplished? For me, it was fairly easy on some of my classes because they were AP classes, and it's like, this is what AP wants you to know in unit 1. And so we need to make sure we hit all these, and I'm going to backwards plan to make sure that we hit those particular concepts. And then along the way, again, this is the part where it's like, can you have them also monitoring how confident they are in what they're learning? And so a lot of the formative assessments and something like that, where there's a lot of structure, it's as they go, they're checking how confident they are in a particular answer, or if they happen to get it right, but they weren't confident, can they get it right the next time around? But again, starting from the end rather than, okay, I'm just going to build this as I go. All right, now we have this somewhat disconnected summative.
I think it's really, you mentioned projects, and I think that when we talk about assessment and we talk about, in a lot of cases, teachers may be thinking about very sort of traditional lessons. But when you're working with a more complex problem or project, something that maybe goes over a number of days, I think it's really important at the outset to be super, super clear on the content that students need to demonstrate and what it will look like in concrete terms if they do it. Because as the work gets more complex, there's really, there are a lot of ways to get sort of lost in the woods there, because there's a lot of interesting stuff happening and there's a lot of cool stuff happening. And it's easy to get, an example that I've seen a lot. We get so caught up in making a quilt in geometry that we lose sight of the geometry and we just make a quilt. But then at the end, the kids don't know what they're supposed to know. So to be really clear on what the academic targets are and what they'll look like in the context of the project, and then to keep revisiting them so that students aren't caught unawares at the end when you say, okay, now here's a quiz or whatever on this content. And they're like, but ask me about making a quilt. That's what we just did. I don't know any of this other stuff. So I think that's one thing to just be mindful of in the planning.
Yeah, I love everything that was said. And Audra, I really like what you said about, self-assessment and like reflection. I remember being a new teacher and like having kids assess themselves, and even like reflection was like really hard for me when I was a new teacher. In fact, it's something I think I still struggle with almost 10 years in. And so you had mentioned the like in the moment kind of whiteboard style, like have them self-assess, but like are there other things that y'all have done in terms of like having kids like reflect or self-assess themselves that you found effective that you could share?
I would say, so one of the things I started doing with all my classes towards the end of my career was when they were working on something that, there was a key or there was a scoring guideline or something like that, or also in a bigger, broader picture, if there was a rubric, they were doing a lot of the self-assessing. So whether they would get the work done and then they'd identify as they went how confident they were, they'd go and check a key or something like that. I started using it on tests because oftentimes there was all right, I get the test back, even if it's been just a day or two, it's like, what was I thinking, or how did I thought I had that one right. And so one of my posts has some things that you can modify that are for checking your homework or checking confidence on a test. And that really helped. One of the most problematic kinds of things that you run into students are the ones that they were really confident in, but they got wrong. And so unless you go back and fix that, and that's really hard to fix, that becomes something that tends to stick with them. So just to add one other piece to what Laura is talking about on and it combines with everybody, is that backward design, especially in something like a project. If I'm building my rubric for the backward design for here's what I want to get out of this, and these are what these levels are, then there's that automatic self-check that students have the ability to do, where it's like, oh, well, I think I'm at a 2 on this, and here's all I need to do to take it to a 3. One last challenge especially for newer teachers, is because a lot of this stuff is the first time you've done it, you don't have exemplars to share for what students might shoot for. And that's kind of good and bad. Sometimes we put up an exemplar and then everybody's project looks exactly like the exemplar. But as you build some, so when students are having a hard time trying to picture what this thing looks like that you're trying to get them to build, again, a really good rubric helps get them there. But then also, like, here's some examples of other types of work that have met some of those standards.
Anybody else want to add for that question before we kind of move on to a different topic? I think it's a really
Oh,
great.
I can tell Audra's just like she has something. So I want to hear what Audra has to say.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say when it comes to self-assessing, like when it comes to what I've done in the classroom, I think that with self-assessment, you can do it with those quick little whiteboards. I've had students do a write-up about how they feel about, I'm an English teacher, so mine was, how do you feel about the skill that you practiced yesterday? Or how do you feel about maybe this specific instance where I was measuring a target that I know they struggle with. Or when I say this is tricky, do you think it's tricky or is it something else? Because I notice sometimes if you put words in kids' mouths, they'll agree with you even if it's not true, especially when it comes to assessment. They get so nervous. And then another thing with self-assessment is that I do is you can actually have students self-assess their own behaviors and managements in class. Not that this is about behavioral management or anything like that, but kind of with being an English teacher, I teach a lot of social emotional skills as well. And so I can ask them, like, do you think that was a fair way for me to divide labor? How would you divide labor if you were to redo this assignment? How would you treat your teammates? And so if you did want to go into a more subjective category for that self-assessment, I think it's totally plausible.
Yeah, for me, reflection and self-assessment live side by side in my practice. And so, and it's really important because anytime students are having an experience, the only way that they can make meaning of the work that they've been doing is in the reflection. Like that's where the learning part happens. And so helping kids gain skill in reflection, we're not a terribly reflective society. It's not like they see it modeled all around them all the time. And so teaching them to do it requires some specific skills. And so, we talk about there are 3 reflection questions. There's the concrete, what did you do? Just recall exactly what you did and then evaluate it. Did you get what you wanted out of it? Did it work the way you expected it to? And then what do you want to do the same or different next time? And that works. You can frame that in a billion different ways. You can do it on sticky notes or on, an exit slip or in a Google form. You can do it in all kinds of ways, and you can use all kinds of variations on those questions. But just in helping kids to practice that pathway over and over and over again, they can gain skill in doing it academically. Like, here's how I approached this math problem. Here's how I approached this essay. Here's how I approached this experiment or this lab, but also in terms of skills and dispositions. Here's how that worked for me in terms of my interactions with my group mates. Here's how that worked in my conversation with my friend in the hall. Here's how this worked on the playground. So they get in the habit of hearing variations on those questions often enough that it becomes one of those neural pathways that's just really well worn, like, tying your shoes or learning to drive a car. After a while, you don't think about it as much.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I was like thinking about like how teachers can go about creating even like a culture of assessment, right? I think how sometimes when I give assessments, whether it's formative or summative, my students are so focused on like, well, what, like, how do I get a good grade? And so like my follow-up question is like, how can teachers like work to create a culture of assessment for learning and not just, oh, I'm doing this assessment because I want a good grade? Like, how do we get kids to a point where they're doing it because they love to learn? All right,
I would love to start with this question because the first time I entered a grade into the grade book, I kid you not, 20 minutes later, a gaggle of girls came and they swarmed me. I was so scared. And they kids care about good grades, and that's just the direction our society is. I think is that we all care about being successful. And so I think you have to set the expectation for the students, and not the expectation, but set up some rules for yourself and be accountable to the students that this is a safe place. We're kind of just doing a sandbox experiment or sandbox experimenting with this skill set and just creating that really safe environment. I always tell them what I'm accountable for. I am accountable for keeping you safe. I am accountable for making sure that we are following school policies, and I am accountable for like coaching you through this. You are accountable for not being terrible and like ruining things and being on task. And I don't say it like that. Of course, I don't want the kids to feel bad, but you're accountable for completing the assignment. And when you have that agreement between you and the students, and they can understand when is the experiment time started, when is it ending, they can feel safe. And then another thing too is I try to avoid grades feeling punitive. Like sometimes I'll hear people say, oh yeah, my students didn't do this, so I gave them this assignment or this assessment, so next time they'll really focus. And they are right. I'm sure their students are more focused after the pop quiz. But sometimes though, what you can do to fight that kind of people pleaser success mentality is make sure that that grade that you put in doesn't send chills down their spine and reminds them that you are an honest bystander and witness of their learning, and you're just giving them some feedback as they're working through the course. I hope I haven't rambled too long.
Never, you always have great contributions. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Jay,
I saw a comment pop up in the chat, the ever horrible question of, is this going to be graded? And especially when if you are in a district or a department where you're kind of moving away from grading formative assessments, because it's like, I don't want to grade you on practice. I want you to practice, and then we're going to grade you on the performance. And this practice is really important to get to that performance. For a lot of students, that's really hard to see, especially if it's a really long unit. And so one of the things, one way to deal with that to some extent is, especially early in the year, you shorten the interval between your summative assessment so that they can see like, oh yeah, I didn't do this formative assessment and it's not showing up, and I'm not able to do this summative assessment that's happening quicker. But I think that the analogies that you work with your students about it being something like an athletic participation or some other kind of performance art participation. It's like, look, we need to do the practice so we can perform, and the perform is the summative of whatever we're gonna do. But I think the other part, as far as the grade part, is yes, they're concerned about grades, and a lot of it is the anxiety about what am I going to achieve. And to some extent, I think you can work on like, well, what is your goal? What do you want to achieve? And so it's kind of unrealistic sometimes for us to really push them for this level when their goal is so far down here, and we can maybe pull them up a little bit. And there's a lot that's packaged in what those goals of students might be. But I think that part where when you're doing enough practice and enough formative assessment and giving them enough feedback, you can take away some of the anxiety because they know how well they know it. They know that they can do this kind of problem when they happen to see something. So yeah, that that drives everybody nuts. It's like, is this graded?
Yeah.
Sort of, because it's that the concepts that you're practicing are going to be graded.
And you know, Jay, it's such a cultural shift for a lot of students and a lot of adults, because we came up in systems that were very teacher oriented, and that were very extrinsically motivated. Like, I do the thing I do so that I get the grade, and everything that I do is graded. Like, that's the experience we had. I mean, I came up in systems that were like, read the chapter, answer the questions at the end, turn them in, and then you get a grade, and that's how you get your grade in the class. And if we're trying to shift students to a mindset that's like, well, you know, you do the homework because it's how you get ready to do the final thing. It's like you go to basketball practice because you want to be able to play well in the game, but they don't count the shots you hit or miss in practice on your score of your game. So, but it's a shift for a lot of students. So just like any culture change, we have to do it, like you said, in small steps. And we also have to be really clear with students and with parents what this is, how this works. And there's got to be a lot of reflection in there too, because I've seen a lot of schools go to formatives are not graded. Homework is not graded. It's formative, it doesn't go in the grade book. And the kids say, woohoo, and they stop doing homework, and then everybody fails the exam. And then the teachers and the parents and the kids are all mad at each other. And the whole thing falls apart. If there's a shorter cycle there, like you mentioned, and if there's a lot of reflection, so you didn't do your homework for 2 nights, and now we're going to have an assessment on that content, and you're going to bomb it, or you bombed it. So what did you do? How did it work for you? What are you going to do differently next time? And then especially if you're working with adolescents, you have to do that over and over and over again, because, you know, their prefrontal cortex is a little fuzzy. So yeah, but I think it's important to recognize this is a big cultural shift for a lot of folks, and it can go sideways. So we have to just be really thoughtful and careful about how we roll it out for everybody.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, it also ties back to like the type of assignments and things that you're also giving kids, right? Like if they're doing things that they enjoy, like they don't actually ask that question. Like we were doing a formative assessment in class today, an escape room, testing their knowledge of like weather maps and how to read it. And like not a single child asked me today, was it graded? But they were very much into the competition of trying to win and escape out of the escape room for a prize that they didn't even know what it was. I just said there was a prize. Right. Nobody finished. Right. But I think too, like sometimes when they're really engaged in a thing, they tend to, do less of the like, oh, like, is this graded? They were like, oh, like class is over. I'm like, yeah, 65 while we're doing this,
Yes.
So I think everybody had like really great contributions. Yeah, anything for a prize. Yeah. Audra, a little bit earlier, you were talking a little bit about AI, and we got like a specific question about, how specifically do you use AI to help develop formative assessment? Like any types or questions that you use like in the moment, if you can give a little bit more information about that.
Uh, Thank you for asking that. There's actually a few different approaches you can, but before I go on a spiel about AI, it's really important to me that I outline some of the AI philosophies that personally the local technological university gave me to outline my use of AI in education. And it's important to have human input in, allow AI to reorganize and reshuffle that input, and then you get different input out. And so the way I do it is I create all my curriculum. And so I put in like the study guide I give them, like literally the exact same study guide, maybe with some extra stuff. I put into an AI. And then that AI will say, can you make a multiple choice test at like a fifth grade reading level with 3 different options and 2 different writing responses, or whatever I need in that moment to prove that they read the one chapter of The Alchemist. And then you get that response back. And before I give it back to my students, which I'm not always the most detail oriented at, I make sure to read it, to make sure it's accurate, to make sure it doesn't have anything that could be construed as offensive. AI does take in all kinds of material from the internet. And so it does take a watchful eye to make sure that you're not getting any of those biases or any of the hurtful stuff on the internet in the AI that you use. But putting in the study guide and then putting in different forms of questions, putting in a list of topics and asking it to put like make some questions based on that. That's something I do a lot for reading quizzes, or if I need to modify a quiz because one kid can't take it the way I have it previously. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like AI has definitely like revolutionized a lot of things, but also has made life a little difficult sometimes in the education sector. As we're like, working to make sure kids are doing their own work. We have another question that just popped up about, getting kids to go back and like read through and check through feedback. This person said that they mark mistakes, like, for students, but they find that students actually aren't going back and like looking over things. And so, what advice do we have maybe for new teachers about like how we can get kids to engage with feedback and like use it?
Well, I can say that one of the ways that I've done that is to ask kids to set a goal based on the feedback that was in the work. So look across your work, and from the feedback that you got, what are 2 things you want to work on the next? I mean, I did this a lot when I was teaching public speaking. So looking at the comments that you got from me and from your peers, because they got 2 peer evaluations, and looking at your self-evaluation, set 2 goals for your next speech, 2 goals in terms of your presentation, and 2 goals in terms of your process, and draw like lines between the goal and the feedback. So the feedback became sort of fodder for reflection and goal setting, and then they would take a look at those before we started the next piece of work. And also I see a comment there about not putting grades on assignments. A lot of times I would not put a grade on stuff. I would, because they can find their grades in the portal anyway if they really want it. And so what I want them to look at is the comments and the feedback that they got. So I think that's a really helpful way to do it too. Just don't put a letter on the first page or a percentage.
And again, I think that's one of the powerful aspects of using rubrics on a variety of kinds of assignments, where you can have indicated where they are on that rubric, or before they turn it in, they put down where they think they are on those rubrics. You can confirm that with them, or you can say, oh, nope, you're actually being hard on yourself because you have this piece on a number 3, so you've actually got a higher score than what you were giving yourself. But then using that also as fairly immediate reflection opportunity where, right, here's what you did. Which of these areas on this rubric do you want to do better on next time, and what will it take to do that? So it's where it's really challenging. The kind of gist of this question is, if it's a homework assignment and I'm checking it right and wrong, and I want you to go and take a look at what you missed and try to make sure that you don't miss it next time around, it's so disconnected from what they were doing, and there's again, unless I'm going to see that again, then why am I going to do that again? And so I think those are the kind of things where students monitoring what they're doing as they perform it, and then finding out, okay, how many things were you really confident that you got right? Okay, good. You know what you know. How many things that you weren't confident you got right? Okay, good. You got lucky and guessed. So how are we going to clear that up? But I think you can also use those tools for yourself as far as your instruction about, there's a lot of people that missed this. I need to not go on until we resolve that particular problem.
Yeah, and Jay, earlier you had talked a little bit about, students sometimes having anxiety around like grading and whatnot. And so I was curious to know, and I mean, Jay can start us off, but definitely everybody contribute. About like, how are you communicating your like grading policies and things with students to help maybe combat some of that anxiety? Like I find that kids sometimes are super anxious when they like don't know the expectations. Um, so how do you communicate, the expectations for like assessment with students and parents like throughout the year?
So I think one of the places you got to start is what is your school, your district, your department support, and so that gets into whether you can do retests, whether you can, whether you curve, whatever it happens to be. But I think if you can lay it out very clearly in your syllabus, your class policies, whatever you are able to do and comfortable doing. And again, because they have memory spans of gnats, just reinforcing that continuously as you get ready for an assessment. Just a reminder, here's what the policies are, to try to ease some of that. The other part is just being clear with them. It's like, if I didn't have 150 students, I might do this assessment differently. And so there's some of you that might actually benefit from a different form of assessment. And in some cases, you can work those things out. So you'll get a kid that's like, I have a hard time writing it, but I could tell you it completely. And so you try to make some opportunities for alternatives. The other part, I think, this is a little bit along those lines, is building in choice. So on some kinds of big project type assessments where there's choices of which path they happen to take, you give that opportunity. One of the things, if you have a lot of open-ended type or essay type questions that you might have as an assessment, there's the part where it's like, oh, they picked the teacher picked the 2 that I knew the least. You give them more and give them some choice on which ones they answer, so you get an idea of like, what do they know the best. And I think for some of the students, knowing that they'll have some opportunity to make a choice, that can alleviate it sometimes. And then you're open to like, this was really a bad day, and I know you perform very differently most of the time. What I'm seeing you do on this particular day is really different than what I've seen you do for the last 2 weeks. So let's have a conversation about what happened. Does that tick off the pieces that you were asking about? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Audra, Laura, y'all want to?
Yeah. So going off about it, kind of showing those expectations to the students. Before I start, I mean, the kids have it in their syllabus. What Jay said about putting it in your syllabus, kids love that. They love being able to have tangible proof that they are not going to fail that minute. Seeing other assignments. Sometimes they go home, have many anxiety moments. They're like looking, making sure that there's not a surprise test. Um, and then also just maintaining their trust. We talk a lot about respect in the classroom, but there's also a little bit of trust. And so, like what Jay said, they forget things very easily, and reminding them, and then also not only reminding them of the assessment standards, but also being very gentle about it and saying, sometimes students can get really, really frustrated if there's a skill right beyond their reach, right? And they might take it out on you. And then reminding them that you're holding them accountable to the assessment. And then in that moment that they're having a hard time, they are not as accountable. And then always, this is where I struggle with, always any platform that a kid can access things, just have it posted big and square in there so that the kids can see it no matter where they are. And then I try to give them a countdown. So if the unit's 3 weeks and the assignment's at the end of the week, I'll try to say, okay, guys, 3 weeks and we're going to be done. Of course, sometimes I don't do that. Just whatever you can remember to do.
Yeah, I think that the scaffolding piece there is really important, especially if students, if their anxiety is a reflection that that the work is sort of at the edge of that zone of proximal development. I think that, that's a good sign that, okay, so we need more scaffolding, we need more predictability. And sometimes that looks like setting down at the beginning of a larger unit or something, even something that's going to take just a couple of days, and laying out clear benchmarks as, so by this point you should have done this, by this point you should have done this, and to make sure that that there are frequent check-ins, especially if students are working in groups, which automatically increases student anxiety, because when you're working, everybody has nightmare stories about group work, right? And so when students are working in groups, they need more frequent check-ins about process and progress. And then I think it's also really important that if students are working in groups, that the final accountability for the academic content is individual. So so it isn't just, well, one student did everything because they didn't want to fail and everybody got the A. Every student is assessed individually on the work that they were supposed to be learning as a group. I think that those are some of the ways that you, like Audra mentioned, you build trust, you build respect, that goes both ways, so that students understand that you're really trying to get an accurate picture of what they know. And if you're not sure, you're going to look for more information. And if you have a data point that doesn't line up with everything else you're seeing, you're going to explore that more. Or it may just be like, yeah, you had a bad day. We all have bad days. So we're going to drop the lowest grade, because, we all need that sometimes, a little bit extra grace as we move through the learning process.
Yeah, I love all of that. And one thing that you said, Laura, actually reminded me of one of the questions that I didn't like highlight as one that I was like actually going to ask, but I actually want to ask it though, of like, have you encountered any biases like in commonly used assessments? Like, are there things that you've done before where you did it and you're like, I don't actually know if this was doing what I needed it to do. And can you share that with us and like what you did about it?
Yeah. And sorry, I'm just going to jump right in on this one because, man, this is like my pet peeve. When I first started teaching back, when the dinosaurs roamed the planet, it was a big deal. Like, it was considered academically rigorous to assign a lot of homework, lots of reading, lots of projects that kids were supposed to do at home. And those were supposed to count as part of the student's grade, and they had to count big. And I wanted to be a rigorous teacher. I wanted, I was serious about what I was doing. I was preparing the minds of tomorrow. And then I had this moment where I realized that a lot of my kids who I knew the content were failing my class. And I sat down with my mentor and I said, I don't understand what's happening here. These kids know this stuff, but they have D's and F's. And he said, well, let's look at your assignments. And then let's look at the kids who are failing. And because it was a small town and I was new to town, but he knew everybody, he said, so your kids who are failing are responsible for younger siblings, or their parents themselves. they work a full-time job, they're living in their car, whatever it was, things that I did not know, could not have known, and didn't need to know because no one owes me their story, right? Nobody owes me any of that information. And then I realized that I have to structure my assessments in a way that all of my kids can demonstrate what they know in a way that gives me the best possible information, because assessment is already like a copy of a copy, because it's an external manifestation of an internal process, right? Like I'm trying to see inside your brain. And if I ask you to demonstrate something using a modality that's already hard for you, or asking you to do it using resources that simply aren't available to you, then I am getting like the most flawed copy ever. I am getting like a copy of a microfiche from a microfilm from a newspaper that was already faded. Oh, there I'm showing my age. So that data is no good. That data is useless to me, and it's useless to the student. It's a waste of time. It's disrespectful. And so I think of that every time I set up an assessment, even in my graduate level courses now, and I preach it at my students nonstop. If a student cannot demonstrate what they know, if they are living in a car, then you have created a assessment instrument that is inherently flawed. So start there. Start with the assumption that no one has any resources outside of your classroom. And that's your baseline. Because otherwise, you don't know what you're assessing. And the same goes for like stuff that requires kids to be able to read really well, or first graders to be able to navigate an iPad or a computer, use a mouse. Like, it's the same thing. Some kids will do well because they have that stuff at home. A lot of kids won't do well because they don't know how to find the little button that makes the sound go up and down because they've never seen it before. Sorry, I'll step off my soapbox.
No, I mean, I loved everything that you said. Like, I feel very inspired by it. In fact, I'm like, that was a mic drop right there, and people in the
Yeah.
chat seem like they agree.
Yeah.
You know, I think like assessment and making it like equitable has just been on a lot of people's minds, and you know, I loved everything that you said. Jay, Audrey, do y'all want to add anything?
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I think that is a mic drop moment. So.
Laura, I think I teared up a little bit when you said that, thinking of some of the most wonderful people I know have some of the hardest stories, and just that was beautiful. But one type of bias that I would like to kind of ask everyone to challenge themselves and think about is a linguistic bias that I found that I had in myself. As I kind of shifted from like a kind of rural area into this other rural area that's outside of a different city. And so there's a little bit of a difference between the way that the students express themselves, and it shows in their written expression. And when I first moved to this area and I was grading, I was like, why are all these things so wordy? And I was like Xing things out. I was like really being hard on kids. I was like, they should know that this is not how we write an academic paper. What in the world? And of course, I was just being sassy and ignorant because these students had real life experiences that shaped how they.
Oh no, did she freeze?
Oh, I think so. Okay. I thought it was just on my end. I think she has some really great things, and hopefully she comes back and she can finish. So Laura, your points though made me also think about another question that I wanted to ask of like, how do we use the data that we get from assessment to like inform our instruction? And like, has there ever been a time where like the data came back and we were like, whoa, got it. Like nobody got anything out of this. So yeah, have you changed your practice drastically before, like based on some assessment data or small changes?
Sorry, I didn't mean for my internet to go out there, but I was just gonna say, don't be the czar of language. And then I completely changed my practice after that. I took a lot of time and did a lot of self-education. I thought it was important that I recognize that linguistic bias, and I took a lot of time to get to know the area and the history of it. And then when I was creating my writing curriculum, the way I came across voice and tone in writing was different. Of course, it's different for everyone, but always thinking about it too. Whenever you have a demographic of student or a box of students that are maybe in a more vulnerable section for whatever reason, they got COVID, whatever, it's important that you think about them as your average learner, because you are only teaching the most vulnerable student in the classroom, which doesn't make sense when I say it, but somebody said it to me once and I always remembered it. So I'll get off.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry you froze, but I think you were saying some like really great things. So I'm glad you were able to like come back and finish. As we kind of go into our last couple of minutes of our panel, what is one piece of advice that you would give to a new teacher who, is maybe struggling in assessment, might be on an island at school, might really have no clue what to do? What is one thing that you want to say to them? Jay, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I'll do it as a quick two-parter. So one is it's okay to be transparent with the students. I think that's valuable in explaining here's why I'm doing it this way and here's what I expect you to get out of it. So there's that piece. It doesn't need to be a mystery about why you're constructing this particular lesson this way. It's like, here's why I'm having you do that. And the other part is I see when I mentored the last few years, I had lots of newer teachers that were putting way too much on themselves as far as the work. And it's okay. And actually research shows it's valuable to put more of that on the students. And so increasing student ownership helps increase student investment. And those are kind of things where, having them do reflection, having them do self-check. I think those would be my pieces of advice.
And thank you. That's our time. Thank y'all so much for your contributions. It was a really great discussion.
Thanks, Monty.
Thank you so
Monty.
much, Monty.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for your fantastic discussion. And let's give a hand in the chat to our panelists. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. As I said before, we are going to send an email tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. It has a bunch of additional resources that are curated by our panelists, the recording of the session, and some of the questions and answers. So please feel free to share that with any of your friends or colleagues who might find it helpful. And then while you are waiting for those assessment resources from tonight's session, there is a resource that you might want to check out that is especially for new teachers. If you are an early career educator, I know many of you are, this was designed to help you navigate classroom management, tech, working with families, community building, classroom design, professional learning, and more. And there's just one last quick thing I want to ask you before we wrap up. And then while I say this, you can grab the QR code off the screen or grab the link to this starter pack in the chat. But the last thing I want to ask of you is to please share any feedback that you have with us. There is a link to a survey in the chat, and we'll also send that link in our follow-up email. We're planning more of these sessions in the future, so we would love to know which topics are most useful to you, any ways that we could experience or improve the experience for you. Thank you so much for attending and for your feedback. Good night.